Thanks so much, Ed. And thank you to the Theosophical Society for this wonderful invitation to come and speak about a book that I wrote over 20 years ago. And it's actually been quite an opportunity for me personally to revisit some of that older work and just get reacquainted with some thoughts and materials that were quite seminal in my early thinking that have taken some interesting travel since then, and I hope to talk about some of those travels. But in rereading my book, so I can become reacquainted with it, I thought, wow, you know, there is some good stuff here. So I'm going to start by reading the first couple of pages. Imagine yourself in the area where I live, and my wife Janet and I still live there, the vicinity of Santa Rosa in Northern California, as it was a few centuries ago. The people here are members of the Pomo Nation. They are relatively short and round-faced and wear no clothing except in winter, when men don a cloak and women a skirt made of shredded redwood bark. They are a peaceful people who build their circular communal huts in nearly 500 villages in an area bounded by the Pacific Ocean to the west and the Coast Range to the east, the Russian River Valley to the south, and the Eel River and Clear Lake to the north. In each Pomo village, everyone's related. An elder settles disputes and attends to the spiritual needs of the people. Every village has its dance house, as well as a sweat house, which is used daily for both healing and ceremonial purposes. The people easily obtain food from the surrounding countryside. Their diet includes acorns, sunflower seeds, beans, hazel and buckeye nuts, manzanita berries, bulbs, roots, tubers, fish, and deer. Everyone learns early in life how to build a house, how to gather food, and how to treat common ailments with local herbs. Average life expectancy is not long by modern standards, but that's due largely to the high rate of infant mortality. Elders often reach ages of 70, 80, and more. Cancer and heart disease are extremely rare, as are degenerative diseases. Life is relatively easy for the Pomo. No one has to work for more than 3 or 4 hours at a time to supply basic survival needs, and the rest of the day is devoted to talk, laughter, play, ceremony, and handcraft. These people are proud and happy, and while they maintain generally friendly relations with other native groups in the region, they are content to live out their days within this relatively small geographical area, traveling only rarely beyond its natural boundaries. They know their land intimately, every stream and hill and every species of herb, tree, bird, frog, fish, lizard, insect, and mammal. Now imagine the scene shifting to the city of Santa Rosa in the present. Well, this is 1995, but not that much has changed. There are far more people living here today, 167,000 at last count, and they have a vastly greater impact on the land. Nearly everywhere they have built or are in the process of building houses, office buildings, and roads. Streams have been rechanneled, hills leveled, floodplains drained, and forests logged. The people obtain most of their food from supermarkets. Few know how to grow or gather it. Though the local economy is still somewhat tied to agriculture, Sonoma County is known for its fine wines, most food is imported from far away. Likewise, few people know personally how to build a house. They rely on professionals to construct their dwellings, and the materials are nearly all imported and toxic. Houses tend to be large and elaborate, and in most cases are inhabited by only one family. A modest house in Santa Rosa costs the equivalent of 7 years' wages for the average worker. Many people cannot afford to own a house, and a few cannot afford even to rent one. These unfortunates live on the streets or in old cars. Nearly everyone has a car. A typical new one costs a year's average wages, but few know how to repair them, and no one in Santa Rosa builds them. Political leaders are elected by the people, but few of the people have ever actually met one of their leaders. For everyone, life requires a constant supply of money, which is used to obtain all goods and services, including entertainment. The money the people use is created thousands of miles away by a process few understand, and is stored and transferred by way of computerized bookkeeping entries. Most people earn money by working at a job 8 or more hours a day, 5 or more days a week. Some people in Santa Rosa are so wealthy that they don't have to work at all. But life is hard for others, particularly those with low-paying jobs and children to feed. Santa Rosa has modern hospitals filled with expensive, up-to-date equipment. Life expectancy has increased greatly compared to that in past decades, but rates of cancer, heart disease, and environmental illnesses are worrisomely high. Most of the music, dances, and ideas current in the city come from far away via television and the internet. Nearly everyone watches television many hours a day. The images they see reinforce their desire for more manufactured consumer goods, products that are available in identical forms nearly everywhere in the world, and therefore for more money. The people of Santa Rosa travel a great deal. In fact, only a minority of residents were born there. Out of necessity, people spend most of each day attending to human systems of money, transportation, and communication. They study roadmaps, store catalogs, and telephone directories, but they spend comparatively little time getting to know the land where they live. Few people can trace the boundaries of the local watershed or name more than a dozen or so indigenous plant or animal species. It seems that between the first and second temporal snapshots, something has gone terribly awry in the relationship between people and nature. And in this regard, Santa Rosa is little different from other places. Everywhere, the story is essentially the same. As biologist Peter Raven put it at the 1987 meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, quote, "We are killing the world," unquote. What has gone wrong, and what can we do about it? So that's the setup for the book. And in it, I look at the covenants with nature that we human beings have negotiated during our evolutionary past. I talk about hunting and gathering, horticulture, animal herding, agriculture, and industrialism. These are ways that we relate with the natural world in order to meet our needs. And through this process of cultural evolution that we've gone through over the past 10,000 years, from hunting and gathering to modern electronic industrial civilization, we have clearly become much more powerful, much more numerous, but also more and more detached from the very natural systems that ultimately support our survival on this planet. So how and why did we move from one covenant to another, from hunting and gathering to horticulture, to animal herding and agriculture, and finally to industrialism? Well, this is a question that, of course, has exercised the minds of anthropologists since the beginning of cultural anthropology. And I learned the most in my own exploration of this question from the American anthropologist Marvin Harris, who points out that all human cultures have three fundamental elements: an infrastructure, a structure, and a superstructure. Well, that doesn't help very much. What is he talking about? Well, the infrastructure of every society is its basic way of relating to the natural world to meet basic needs for producing food, energy, materials for making houses and clothing, and so on, and also for reproducing. It's the basics, right? The material basics of existence. Then every society has a structure, which is what we might call the political economy, the way people relate to one another in order to distribute whatever goods are available within that society and make decisions about what they're going to do together. And then every society has a superstructure, which is the stories they tell each other to justify it all, to make sense of it all, to educate their children. This, of course, includes the areas of spirituality and religion, but also in the modern world, it would include economic theory, science, and so on. So there isn't a single human culture that's been identified that doesn't have all three of these basic elements. Marvin Harris's insight was that the way we get our food, the infrastructure, has a largely deterministic influence on just about everything else. Why did he come to this point of view? Well, it was through, years of looking at the evidence. If you know how a group of people get their food, you can pretty well predict what kind of social structure they're going to have and what general kind of belief system they're going to have. If it's a hunting and gathering group, you know pretty well that these folks are going to live in fairly small bands of maybe 50 to 100, little variation beyond those extremes, but not that much. Because that's all that the land can support in that mode of existence. And so with people living that close together and that close to the land, there aren't very many opportunities for one person to lord it over everyone else. So hunter-gatherer groups tend to be very egalitarian. You don't see, kings and chiefs in hunter-gatherer societies. Their spirituality tends to be based in a kind of immediate recognition of the sacred in all of their surroundings. The only specialist in sacred activities among hunter-gatherers is the shaman. And that's a situational authority. In other words, the shaman isn't more special than anybody else when it comes to divvying up tonight's food or anything, or making decisions or anything like that. It's just if the questions having to do with the sacred realm and one, personal psyche are at the fore, this is somebody whose advice you call on. The evidence suggests that hunting and gathering was superseded, that we gave it up because of ecological necessity. In other words, back around 7 to 10,000 years ago, we human beings in certain places at least encountered circumstances where hunting and gathering was no longer viable, and there were opportunities to subsist in other ways, namely by either animal herding or horticulture. Horticulture distinguished from agriculture in terms of scale. Horticulture is from the Latin hortus, meaning garden, and sometimes we call this swidden or slash and burn. Typical horticultural societies are village societies, and they typically have a headman or chief. And in many horticultural societies, the headman or chief is someone who maintains status within the society by giving stuff away. So very often, the chief in a horticultural group will be somebody who has the most threadbare attire and the fewest ornaments because they've had to give it all away in order to get everybody else to look up to them. And they'll have periodic feasts at which they will, they'll work hard for months and months at a time so they can gather up enough surplus to have a big party where they give it all away. And that's why everyone is happy to have a chief around. But then it's clear that at some point ecological necessity and opportunity led to a shift toward field crops, agriculture from the Latin ager, meaning field. So instead of diverse temporary gardens, we moved to permanent field cropping and the development of grains, especially to support larger populations, because now instead of just villages, we're talking about permanent cities. And within agricultural communities, there is aggregation of power, not just chiefs, but kings, who are visible by means of their ability to aggregate tribute, what we would call taxation today, and thereby to accumulate wealth and to basically make decisions on behalf of the society as a whole. And it's within these agricultural societies that we see spirituality and religion mutating into a situation of a kind of celestial hierarchy, the belief in a celestial hierarchy of gods and goddesses to mirror the hierarchy of power that exists within society. And in fact, the king derives his authority by being the representative of the sky god who is at the head of the pantheon of deities. Now, of course, historically, there are variations in these patterns, but there's a remarkable uniformity as well. And again, it's once one knows how a society is relating to the natural world on the most basic level, all of the rest of these things become fairly predictable. And the variations also become predictable on the basis of unique ecological circumstances. Now, in addition to these that I've just described, we now more recently, in the last couple of hundred years, have developed a covenant with nature that really deserves a category of its own. And we say today that we live in industrial societies. Well, industrial society is every much as different from everything that's gone before as, say, ancient agricultural societies were from hunters and gatherers. And perhaps the difference is even more extreme. Because in modern industrial societies, we've increased urbanization to an extraordinary degree, to where today more than half the world's people live in cities. That's never happened before. In a typical agricultural society, 75 to 90% of the people have to work at agriculture in order to produce enough of a surplus to maintain urbanites who then specialize in, being scribes or kings or lawyers or whatever else. And of course, that's one of the hallmarks of early civilizations, that once we had cities and once we had agricultural surpluses, then we see the development of these other cultural phenomena like writing, money, beginnings of science, mathematics, and so on. Well, all of these are hyper-developed within industrial society, and of course, population densities have grown in the last couple of hundred years. In 1800, there were 1 billion of us on planet Earth. Today, there are 7.5 billion after just 200 years. Extraordinary. Never before happened in human history. I could go on. So what has changed? What made the shift from agrarian society to modern industrial society? Well, we talk about developments in economics and key inventions and so on, but it's clear that there's something else at work here. And years of thought and speculation and research finally led me to a duh moment back in the 1990s when I finally realized something that a lot of ecologists had already figured out, which is that the difference is energy. Energy is what enables us to do everything that we do. And people in horticultural societies and hunter-gatherer societies were deriving most of their energy simply from the food they ate. In agricultural societies, some muscle power is employed, by harnessing the animal muscles, in many cases of enslaved peoples, but also of enslaved animals, horses, donkeys, oxen, and so on. But with modern industrial society, what we've done is we've found sources of energy that are extraordinary in comparison with anything we had before. Before maybe we had firewood for heat as a fuel. But when we discovered fossil fuels, we found sources of energy that were concentrated, portable, and cheap. And as a result, all hell has broken loose. We've used fossil fuels to transform agriculture. Why are only 2% of Americans, 1 to 2% of Americans today listed in the census as full-time farmers? How is that even possible when in an agrarian society you needed 70% of the population to work at agriculture in order to support, a few people living in cities? Well, it's possible because of mechanization of agriculture. We have a globalized society. Why? Because of cheap transportation running on fossil fuels, ships, trains, planes, automobiles. So we have a highly mobile society as well as a globalized society. It's a hyper-rational society also. By having so many people living in cities, we have been able to develop the knowledge base to an extraordinary degree. We have specialists working in every imaginable discipline, raising the level of human knowledge in every imaginable area to levels no human could conceive of previously. So fossil fuels have done a lot for us in the last 100 to 200 years. But our reliance on fossil fuels has also been a bargain with the devil for two basic reasons. One of which, of course, is that as we burn these fuels, we pollute our environment. And there are many kinds of pollution that result from fossil fuels, everything from plastic in the oceans to nitrogen fertilizer made from natural gas that ends up in waterways and creates dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and other similar zones around the planet. But most notably, as a result of climate change, we are changing the chemistry of the atmosphere and the oceans quite dramatically and quite rapidly. The atmospheric concentration of CO2 was about 280 parts per million when we started out the Industrial Revolution, and it's over 400 parts per million now. And it's the relationship between CO2, methane, and nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere and global temperatures is very well established. We have decades of data as well as computer models to go on here. And so we're still pumping it out into the atmosphere at ever growing rates. But the other reason this was a bargain with the devil is that fossil fuels are, by their very nature, depleting non-renewable resources. So we have built a civilization on the basis of the ever-increasing extraction and one-time only burning use of these fuels that are finite in quantity. So as we dig them out of the ground and burn them, we are, by definition, depleting what's left and leaving less for future generations. So my work in the 20 years or so since this book has come out has been mostly in this area, looking at fossil fuels, our relationship with fossil fuels, how are we doing in terms of the meter on the gas tank, what's the status of climate change, and so on. And that's the essence of my work with Post Carbon Institute. So how are we doing? Well, let's take a quick inventory. Coal, the first fuel of the Industrial Revolution. At first, the belief was that we had extraordinary amounts of coal in the ground. And if we're simply talking about raw resources, there are still extraordinary amounts of coal left in the ground. But in I would say the last 15 years, coal geologists have gotten a lot more realistic in terms of looking at how much of that coal can be produced economically. Much of it is too deeply buried. The coal seams are too thin to be mined economically, or the coal is of too low a quality. Here in the geologists call it the Illinois Basin. There's a lot of coal, but it's high sulfur coal, and producing it and burning it is too expensive. That's why very little is actually being produced here, as compared to Wyoming, which is where a lot of our coal is coming from now. We used to think of places like Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and so on as being the main coal-producing places for the U.S., but not anymore. Why? Because most of the best coal is gone from those areas. It's already been mined. Same thing with Britain, same thing with Germany. China coal production has reached an extraordinarily high level and is now topping out and starting to decline. Projections are that global coal supplies will begin to decline sometime around 2025. Similar situation with natural gas. Conventional natural gas production here in the United States has been in decline since the 1970s. But in the last few years, we've seen a big increase in natural gas production here in the U.S. from unconventional sources, namely shale gas produced by hydrofracturing. So places like Pennsylvania, Arkansas, Louisiana, East Texas have seen huge economic booms from fracturing shale rock to release natural gas that's tightly bound up in these rocks that have very low permeability. But the life cycle of shale gas has probably been overestimated by the industry. That's at least the analysis that we've done in-house at Post Carbon Institute. And we have some very detailed studies you can look at on our website. The problem with shale gas is individual wells deplete so fast. The typical rate of production declines 60% in the first year. So that means that companies have to drill and drill and drill in order to keep the stuff coming. And while the areas that have shale gas are pretty large, the only spots that are profitable to drill are small core areas, or sweet spots, sometimes the geologists call them. And those are getting drilled out really fast. So we're likely to see a peak and decline in shale gas production before 2020 here in this country, which would mean the peak and decline in all natural gas. Globally, probably something like 2025. Similar situation in the oil industry. Regular conventional oil, the stuff that fueled the 20th century, has been wavering and starting to decline since about 2005. And so the industry is turning to unconventional forms of oil, like the tar sands or oil sands in Alberta, Canada, more properly called bitumen. This isn't really free-flowing oil. It's sticky, tarry goop that has to be cooked in order to become liquid so that you can refine it. And the energy costs of doing that are very high. So the whole point is to get energy from this stuff. So if you have to invest a lot of energy in the process, then that automatically means it's a very inefficient source. And so it needs a very high oil price for it to make sense. Here in the United States, we have a big boom, again, as a result of applying hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling to what petroleum geologists call tight oil reservoirs. And we find these in North Dakota, again in South Texas and a few other places. And so U.S. oil production has increased by several million barrels a day in just in recent years as a result of these technological breakthroughs. But again, it's very similar to the situation with shale gas. Individual wells deplete very rapidly. There are only a few core areas that are profitable to drill. And the industry is operating at a financial loss. Virtually every barrel of tight oil is produced at a financial loss at current oil prices. The industry needs prices in the range of $100 a barrel to expand. And when oil prices get to $100 a barrel, the whole economy starts to shiver and shake because, people who have to pay $5 a gallon for gasoline suddenly can't afford to make their mortgage payments. And, it has a knock-on effect throughout the whole economy. So we're in a new era now in this 21st century where the old energy economics don't apply anymore. There's no longer a Goldilocks price for oil where it's profitable for the industry yet affordable for the rest of society. That zone just doesn't, it's not either the industry is doing okay as it was in 2012, 2013 with $100 a barrel oil, and the economy is just barely hanging on by its fingernails. Or you have a situation where, as it is now, oil is $45 a barrel and the industry is essentially closing up shop, not investing in future production capacity, seeing profits declining every single quarter and so on. All of which is to say that the fossil fuel era, when you look at it from a long historical perspective, is a blip in time. We're talking about maybe 300 years altogether. So what are we going to do for an encore? How are we going to keep industrial civilization going, all 7.5 billion of us, closed and housed and fed with, globalized transport networks and industrial machinery and so on? Well, this is a question that is vexing the best minds on the planet right now, believe me. And in being in this business, I talk to a lot of people, and every time I give a talk, I get an email from somebody who says, well, why haven't you looked at nuclear power? Or, don't you know that I have an invention that will enable you to run your car on seawater? Or, And we look at all of these things. Nuclear power is basically dying right now because it's too expensive and too risky, especially after what happened in Fukushima in Japan 3 or 4 years ago. There may be a couple of new nuclear power plants being built in the U.S., but mostly they're being decommissioned, which is, by the way, a very expensive and risky process. Nobody really knows how to do it. France is starting to turn away from nuclear power. Germany is turning away from nuclear power. Japan has most of their power plants shut down. Korea is turning away from nuclear power. China, Russia, a few other countries are still investing, but it's very clear at this point it's not the energy source of the future. How about solar and wind? I am a big advocate of solar and wind power. My wife Janet and I have had solar on our roof for 20 years, which means we have some of the most antique solar panels you're likely to find anywhere. But whatever conjunction you want. I spent a year working with a colleague at Post-Carbon Institute, David Fridley, who is on the energy analysis team at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories. And we looked very carefully at the prospects for a 100% solar and wind powered future. And I won't give you the whole talk because it is a whole talk. Even an hour's presentation is very abbreviated. But just the extreme highlights. Our conclusion was that the intermittency of sun and wind is a big problem. It has to be solved in one of three possible ways, either with storage or some kind of backup power. These days it's mostly done with natural gas peaking plants. So, if the sun isn't shining, you fire up the natural gas plant. Or with demand management, instead of expecting to use energy whenever we feel like it, we time our energy use to when it's available, when the sun's out and the wind is blowing. Those are our options. And all of them carry a cost, either a behavioral cost or an investment cost. And that cost is pretty low in the early stages because we already have backup power. We already have natural gas power plants all over the place that can be called upon, to back up solar and wind when needed. But if you start to get up to, 80, 90% of your electricity production coming from these intermittent sources, then it starts to get really difficult and expensive to manage the grid and to make it all come out right. Then there's the problem that we only use about 20% of our energy as electricity. The other 80% we use as liquid and gaseous fuels to heat our homes, to power our cars and agriculture and all of these other things. So in order to transition to an all solar and wind energy future, that means transitioning to using electricity for just about everything. So yes, we have a few electric cars on the road now, but not that many. And what about electric 18-wheelers? And are we going to have electric Boeing 787s? No, actually, because the physics just doesn't work. Yes, we could theoretically run these planes on compressed, supercooled hydrogen, but there's maybe one prototype, and getting from there to where we want to be is trillions of dollars and decades away. And do we have the trillions and the decades? Maybe for one industry, but we're talking about really reconfiguring every industry you can name. Whether it's agriculture, manufacturing, transportation, basically the entire economy. So we're working at Post-Carbon Institute right now on a project that we call There's No App for That. In which we're putting forward the argument that, what folks want is a techno fix. They want a technological solution that will enable us to keep living essentially the way we are living right now. Whether it's with solar or wind power or nuclear power or this gadget or that gizmo, we're going to, make this switch, and technology is going to save us. And of course, the reason we have that expectation and hope is partly because that's how things worked in the 20th century. Technology, whatever problem we had, if it was polio, we found a vaccine. If it was World War II, we, solved that with the atomic bomb. Well, that had some side effects. Well, actually, every technological intervention has had side effects. And then we invent new technologies to deal with those unintended consequences. And those new technologies have unintended consequences, so we have to keep running faster and faster to stay ahead of the side effects. That's the technological game. But we're conditioned to believe that we're going to solve all our problems with technologies because we have been pretty good at it so far, but all of those technologies require energy. And the central problem that we're talking about is a future where we may not have enough energy. When David Fridley and I looked at the renewable future, we could see, ways of dealing with all of these constraints, every single one of them. But the problem in the end was one of scale. Expecting to be able to produce as much energy as the world is using right now, especially as America is using right now, and more energy in the case of economic growth, is just unrealistic given the kinds of constraints that we're talking about. So if we could imagine a future in which Americans used, let's say, 1/10 the per capita energy that we're currently using, well, from an investment standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, that's much easier to imagine. But what's a world in which Americans use 1/10 the energy we're currently using? What stops us from getting there? Well, what stops us from getting there is the superstructure of modern industrial civilization. You remember, every society has a superstructure, a way of making meaning. Well, in modern industrial civilization, we have a superstructure. You could call it a religion of technology, progress, and growth. And again, this largely comes from experience. The reason this overwhelmingly prevalent belief in the efficacy of technology and the inevitability of technological progress and economic growth, the reason for it is that was our experience during the 20th century, and it became not just a set of beliefs that were reinforced by, let's say, advertising and economics schools, but by political circumstances. Think back to the Great Depression. What were the causes of the Great Depression? Well, that's a long discussion, but most economists agree that one of the causes was the problem of economic overproduction. With cheap fossil fuels, we could make stuff and assembly lines. We could make consumer products in larger quantities and faster than people could buy them. So we solved that problem by stoking demand. We created a consumer economy where we encouraged demand with advertising. The advertising industry is enormous today. In the 1920s, it was practically nothing by comparison. So we created a $1 trillion a year advertising industry. We also created another multi-trillion-dollar industry in the form of consumer credit, making it easy for people to go into debt now, to buy stuff, to consume now and pay later. So you push consumption forward in time. So we do this on the basis of the expectation that the economy will continually grow. And as long as the economy is continually growing, we'll be able to make the payments on all of that debt. Right? But if the economy stops growing, then suddenly all the bills come due. And of course, that's the nightmare of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department and your local banker and real estate salesman and everybody else. If this engine stops speeding up, then it's not just boredom, it's calamity, right? People lose their jobs. And we got a taste of this in 2008. And the problem was solved with what? More debt. Vastly more debt. This Federal Reserve went into overdrive with quantitative easing with lowering interest rates to make it easier for people to borrow money and institutions to borrow money and so on. So here we are, you know, at a historical moment where the economy really doesn't want to grow anymore because energy is getting more expensive and harder to get. And yet we have the need and expectation, the institutional as well as the psychological need for more growth. This is one of those moments that we know from the history books. You know, there have been something like 15,000 human cultures that anthropologists have identified. We identify a culture by means of unique language and customs and so on. But there have been only about 24 civilizations. Civilization from the Latin root kiwis, meaning city. You know, so civilization is by definition an agricultural society with cities and therefore, you know, writing and money and all those things. There have only been about 24 of them, and they have this nasty habit of collapsing. It's happened over and over again. And we tell ourselves it can't happen here because we have such a shiny, wonderful civilization. We have such smart people, and we have such great technology that it couldn't happen to us. And we're such good people. We certainly don't deserve to have it happen to us. I spoke yesterday morning about world ages and asked the question, are we at the end of a world age? And, you know, in my line of work, I am at conferences with environmental leaders and scientists, climate scientists, looking at not just at climate change and fossil fuel depletion, but the loss of biodiversity. The phrase "the sixth extinction" was mentioned yesterday. Topsoil depletion. We're losing 24 billion tons of topsoil a year. Loss of fresh water, on and on and on. You know, even if we solve the energy problem, we have all of these other systemic problems that are intimately tied to the way we live, the way we have organized modern industrial society. This is a systemic crisis, and it's not going to be solved with technical adjustments. We are at a moment where inevitably the systems that we rely on are going to be engulfed in rapid change. The economic system, our food system, those are going to have knock-on effects and impacts on global war and peace and more. This is a civilizational change, a crisis moment. There's no doubt about that. So what's the right thing to do at a moment like this? You know, what do we need? It's, you know, yes, it's helpful to have folks working on things like renewable energy, you know, technical solutions, and I by no means do I put down these you know, pioneers who are doing wonderful work in you know, permaculture, in working with family planning in poor countries, and all the ways that, you know, good people are trying to hold crisis at bay. But I think there's more that actually needs to happen. This is, if this is not a problem that's going to be solved with a technical solution, what really is called for? It's a profound ethical and moral change, I think. It's the only thing that's going to make a fundamental difference and lead to a different kind of culture. And what am I talking about with a moral and ethical change? What's actually required of us as a species right now is to come to terms with natural limits. We have managed to avoid limits, population limits, you know, limits to food, natural resources, soil, et cetera, for the last few decades simply because we had a lot of cheap energy to throw at the situation. You know, whatever the problem was, throw some cheap energy at it and you can find a temporary technological solution. But without the cheap energy, that doesn't work anymore. Plus, you know, there's so many of us, and with more population growth, you know, we're adding 80 million people a year right now. A lot of people say, well, population is not a problem anymore. Those ecologists back in the 1970s, they were so wrong-headed. There hasn't been a population crisis. Well, you know, add together London, New York, Tokyo, Mexico City. That's about what we're adding annually. And for all of those people, we have to find places to live, something to eat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're having trouble, you know, taking care of us who are already here. So, you know, self-restraint is the only thing that's going to make a difference. Self-restraint in terms of human numbers and in terms of our load on the environment, how much we're consuming. And of course, when we talk about rates of consumption, it's the folks in the wealthy industrialized countries that are going to have to make the difference. Honesty about our situation and self-restraint. These are ethical, moral questions, and they are simple questions. They're not abstruse. They don't require trained professional philosophers to, you know, talk them to death with, you know, abstruse terminology and so on. It's very, very simple. How many of us are there, and how much are we using? How can we find ways to make our resource extraction and usage less injurious to the earth? Yes. How can we do it more efficiently? Yes. There are, you know, ways that we, at the margins, that we can make our way of life less harmful to the planet. But at the end of the day, it comes down to self-restraint in terms of numbers and per capita consumption. That's also, I think, the essence of what a new spirituality is going to be for whatever comes next. And I can't tell you what it's going to look and feel like, because, you know, if we try to imagine what will be the superstructure, the belief systems of whatever social arrangements come after us, you know, after industrial civilization, something, but what? And what's it going to feel like? What will people believe? You know, we're looking through the eyeglasses, through the lenses of people who have lived our entire lives with, you know, the Shopping Channel and Howdy Doody and, you know, all the rest. You know, we have a certain way of looking at the world that is entirely conditioned by industrial civilization. So for us now to look forward and imagine what people, you know, 200 years from now are going to be believing about the world, I don't have much faith in that. But if there are going to be people around 200 years from now, they will be people who have learned self-restraint. If nothing else, by virtue of hard experience. So I think somehow our new covenant with nature, that hopefully we, but certainly our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren will be evolving, will be one in which we once again see the natural world as the source of all that we have, and in many ways all that we are. We will once again be people who have a sense of our own limits. You know, I think living through the end of a civilization, hopefully, would be kind of a hubris buster. And if it's anything that we industrial humans need, it's a little less hubris. I think we need right now to have a sense of witness. because what we are witnessing is extraordinarily important. And rather than tuning it out, I think we need to be very aware of what's happening. We need to care for the casualties, and there will be more as time goes on, not just human casualties, but non-human casualties. We need to model the attitudes as well as the lifestyle choices, the ethical sensibilities and behaviors that make sense in a world going through this kind of transformation. If we want civilization to survive, doesn't it have to be a civilization that is worth surviving? You know, is it really important that 500 cable channels be available to people in the next who come later? Or are there, you know, what have we achieved as a society that is worth preserving? I think we need to get busy thinking about that question very hard, and then starting to put some real vigorous effort into preserving those things. Be the holder of a larger view of life that recognizes cyclic change and maintains the highest vision of who we are and can be as moral and ethical beings. In times like this, I think there's a tremendous temptation for people to get caught up in tribalism. You know, to look for security in a group that looks like themselves, thinks like themselves, and that can be differentiated from others who can be blamed for the pain and suffering that's coming at us in various ways. If we go down that road, it doesn't end well. So having, as the Theosophical Society does, a universal view of humanity as one is extraordinarily important in this time. So I started by reading a little bit from the very beginning of this book, and so I'm going to finish by reading the last paragraph. As the old myth crumbles, taking with it institutions, economies, and lives, perhaps we need a story to make sense of the deepening chaos and to guide us toward a more coherent and sustainable pattern of existence. But that new story will serve us well only if it draws its power from the depths of our being, where culture, nature, and spirit all converge. Is it a fact, or is it only wishful thinking that as the cement facade of civilization grows more impressive, it also becomes more brittle? Cracks continually appear, and through those cracks we see the human vulnerability and the woundedness of those who inhabit the edifice. Deeper still, we occasionally catch a glimpse of light, a flame blazing at the core of humanity, a fire that burns at the heart of creation itself. It is the generative potential of life, and here lies our hope. In the heat of world destruction and world renewal, can we but learn to dwell in that flame? Thank you very much. This gentleman here.
I'm curious about any comments that you might have about the role of complexity science in our current situation. Do you regard it as interesting or just an artifact?
Yeah, it is interesting. I don't claim to be an expert on the subject, but you know, complexity theory, resilience theory, I think is also very important. You know, how do complex systems change? I think it's very usul. And I can't say very much. Maybe you have a background in that area and could tell us more, but what I've read of it is very interesting.
please pass the Prozac. If you had just been elected President of the United States and you had control of both Senate and the House, what 3 World War II level initiatives would you start ASAP?
Yeah. I think actually the most important thing is to help people understand what's happening to them. You know, because without that, we're just playing the blame game. So helping folks understand where we're going. You know, with the Great Depression and World War II, we had a leader who, you know, held these fireside chats, and he said, you know, look, we have some hard times here. We may be going into harder times, but if we stay together, if we pull together, work cooperatively, we can get through this to a future that's worth working for. What was it Winston Churchill said? I can only promise you blood, sweat, tears, and toil. And the British people said, okay, we're with you. Today, if you're a politician, the only thing that will get you elected is just promising absurd goodies that, that's where I would start. But then I would look at reforming the financial system, because I think that's in some ways the most vulnerable of all of the systems we've been talking about. And then fundamental reforms in our food system and agriculture so that we're storing carbon in the topsoil rather than, right now, agriculture is a big source of CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but it could be a way of storing carbon in the soil long term. And by doing so, the kinds of changes to agriculture that would enable that to happen would also make agriculture much more, you know, environmentally benign in other respects. So, you know, those would be good places to start.
You mentioned that we have to have constraint, both self-constraint in our ethics and consumerism and all that, and constraint as far as population expansion is concerned. There's a third way, and that is to recover our renewable resources that we've degraded. You just fringed on one of those by saying we could store some carbon in agricultural areas. There's much bigger ways that this can be done, and mainly it has to do with recovering nature. And nature sustains us, and therefore it behooves us to sustain nature.
Right.
And to be able to get all the natural services from nature and start depending more and more on those, like civilizations did in the past. And this goes ahead, and this has economic and social and cultural and personal and ecological benefits. And it satisfies a lot of values. And unless all those values are satisfied pretty much simultaneously, I don't think we're going to go anywhere. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I totally agree. And part of what we're going to have to do is just get out of nature's way. I mean, there certainly are ways of, as you say, using nature's services that are more sustainable. But, you know, right now we're seeing species disappearing at 1,000 times what biologists have determined would be the normal rate of extinction. To significantly change that, we're going to have to put more and more areas just sort of off limits to resource extraction on the part of human beings. Biologist E.O. Wilson suggests we need half of Earth set aside as basically nature preserves. And then the other half, you know, we human beings could continue using. And that sounds like a, you know, pretty bold proposal, but, you know, we've actually done a lot of that so far. We've set aside millions upon millions of acres as nature preserves. And those are areas where species are still thriving. And not just areas of land, but also ocean need to be set aside so that there can be some recovery. Yeah. And then,
are you aware that various oil and gas companies here in the United States are putting a major emphasis on lessening the carbon pattern that formerly they have left? In addition, oil and gas companies based in the United States are leaving the Canadian tar sands like crazy. And I can name quite a few companies that have recently sold their holdings. Number one, it's dirty. Number two, they're very cost ineffective, right, because it costs far more to transport them and then to crack that, right, tar sand. So oil and gas companies are becoming more economically ecological, yeah, currently right now.
Yes, and yeah, I hear what you're saying, and it's true that the oil and gas industry is seeking to become more energy efficient in its own operations, but the whole point of the oil and gas industry is to extract fossil fuels so that they can be burned once and for all. So these are industries that, you know, we depend on them, absolutely, for everything that we do today in industrial societies. I mean, we really need to recognize that. It's not as though the oil and gas and coal industry could go away tomorrow and everything would be fine. If they did, we would have economic collapse instantly. But at the same time, these industries have created not just the dependency, but the conditions for, you know, there's no future to this way of life that we've created based on these fuels. So ultimately, these industries do have to go away. So we just have to arrange, you know, nice retirement parties and find a happy way to make the transition, if possible. Right over here.
Well, to tell you the truth, I've considered every single one of these matters for years, off and on, depending on what particular flavor the politicians happen to be handing out, or any number of things. But I honestly have to say that, in my opinion, the elephant in the room tends to be ignored. And the elephant in the room is empowerment of women. Because women need to be able to decide how many children they're going to have, and whether they can raise those children effectively, and all of those kinds of and I don't honestly know if the planet can sustain 7.5 billion people. Maybe it could have sustained 7.5 billion people had we never developed fossil fuels and the various population crashes and growths around the world had been distributed enough that all the cultures learned to live without those things simply as a matter of evolutionary choice. But as it stands right now, how in the world can we sustain 7.5 billion people, and what are we going to do? When are we going to get the political will to stand up and say we can't do it?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that comment, and I completely agree with you with the point you made at first about the status of women in society. The most effective work that's being done in the world today on family planning is work that empowers women, especially in poorer countries. And one of our post-carbon fellows is a gentleman named Bill Ryerson, who runs an organization called the Population Media Center. And what they do is work in mostly poor countries with very high population growth rates and hire creative artists in those countries to write and produce usually radio soap operas, sometimes television, depends on the country. And in the scripts of these soap operas, you know, basic family questions come up. And questions about women's empowerment, their role in the family, about family size, and so on, get directly addressed, and people learn. And it's been found that these radio soap operas have been the most effective and inexpensive way of changing population growth rates in the countries where this has been tried. So it's largely a matter of attitude and thought, rather than just, you know, distributing free birth control. It's a cultural issue. And so that's a very good point. I think we probably just about reached the end of our time, have we? Okay, yeah.